Berlin was burning. Flames climbed the shattered skyline as Soviet shells turned entire districts to dust. Amid the chaos, scientists stuffed blueprints into crates and burned papers that might condemn them. They were not soldiers, yet their hands had built the most terrible. Weapons of the Reich, engines that could reach the edge of space, gases that could silence entire battalions, medicines born from cruelty. The Third Reich was dying, but its knowledge was alive, scattered like shrapnel across the continent. When Allied troops entered the ruins, they found laboratories that looked decades ahead of their time. Jet aircraft with swept wings, rockets taller than buildings, guidance systems that could strike London from 200 miles away. What they discovered was not merely evidence of war crimes, it was evidence of a future already imagined. Whoever claimed that future would rule the post-war world. While Europe celebrated peace, a second war began in silence, a race for minds. American and Soviet intelligence teams swept through the same towns, each desperate to find the engineers who could build the next generation of power. This was not about justice, it was about possession. The Americans called it Operation Overcast. Later it would earn a new name, Operation Paperclip. In early May 1945, a U.S. Army unit reached the Baltic base of Peenemünde, once the heart of Germany's rocket program. The facility was a skeleton of concrete and twisted steel. Waiting for them was a young man in civilian clothes who spoke perfect English. "I am Wernher von Braun," he said. "We have been expecting you." He was 33 years old, brilliant, arrogant, and unrepentant. The men who arrested him had no idea that the quiet engineer before them would soon build the rockets that carried the first Americans into space. Von Braun and his team offered a bargain, their knowledge for their freedom. To Washington, it was a moral nightmare and a strategic gift. These men had designed terror itself, yet their equations could unlock the future. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but another was already forming, the Cold War, and brains were its ammunition. Under secret orders, hundreds of German scientists were rounded up and moved to American custody. Their Nazi files were edited, their crimes erased. The justification was simple. If the United States refused them, Stalin would take them. And so, under the cover of victory, America began recruiting its former enemies. Within weeks, cargo planes lifted off from Europe carrying blueprints, prototypes, and the minds that had conceived them. The world thought the war was over. In truth, a new one had just begun, one fought not with armies, but with intellect, and sealed by a single metal paperclip. The surrender of Germany left a vacuum that both superpowers rushed to fill. The Soviet Union moved first, raiding laboratories and seizing entire research teams. Trainloads of scientists vanished eastward. The Americans responded in kind but quietly. What began as Operation Overcast became Paperclip, an organized effort to claim the brains of the Reich before Moscow could. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, oversaw the process. Its officers carried folders marked with two colors, red for war criminal, blue for retain. In theory, red files meant exclusion. In practice, blue sheets were clipped over them, concealing the past beneath a single piece of bent metal. A bureaucratic sleight of hand turned murderers into consultants, SS officers into specialists. The symbol of a paperclip would soon bind together truth and deception, more tightly than any oath. Men like Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen slave labor at the Mittelwerk tunnels, and Kurt de Boos, who had managed V-2 launches against London, were quietly shipped to America. Their SS records vanished. New resumes appeared describing them as patriotic engineers forced to serve Hitler. Washington accepted the fiction because it needed the results. A moral compromise became national policy. By late 1946, the first groups of German scientists and their families had arrived at Fort Bliss, Texas and White Sands, New Mexico. They lived comfortably inside fenced compounds, guarded by soldiers who had fought against them only months earlier. Locals called them the Germans. The military called them invaluable. Under the desert sun, they reassembled captured V-2 parts and launched them skyward, missiles, reborn with new insignia and a new flag. Each success erased another piece of memory. In the newspapers, they were presented as refugees from tyranny. Smiling portraits replaced the mugshots of Nuremberg. The nation wanted to believe that genius could wash away guilt. Only a few officers whispered their unease. One colonel wrote in a classified memo, "We have taken the brains but left the conscience behind." But the Cold War was intensifying, and conscience was a luxury America could no longer afford. By 1947, hundreds of scientists had been absorbed into military and industrial research. Their work accelerated jet propulsion, radar, chemical engineering, and above all, missile technology. The same hands that once built Hitler's weapons now designed America's shield. Operation Paperclip had transformed enemies into assets, turning the darkness of the past into the light of progress, or so it appeared. In truth, the light was only a reflection, bright enough to blind those who dared to look too closely. By 1948, Operation Paperclip had outgrown its secrecy. What began as a desperate race against the Soviets had become an institutional machine, one that traded morality for progress. The United States now possessed the world's most advanced scientific minds, but it also carried the hidden cost of their sins. Every rocket that rose from the desert carried ghosts from the tunnels of Mittelwerk, where thousands of slave laborers had died beneath their designs. Wernher von Braun's group at Fort Bliss quickly became the heart of America's new rocket program. The engineers lectured U.S. officers in broken English, teaching them about propulsion, trajectory, and guidance systems. Many of the Americans were too young to have fought in Europe. They saw the Germans not as enemies, but as mentors. In the evenings, von Braun hosted social gatherings, playing piano and telling stories of scientific ambition. Misunderstood by politics, he was charismatic, careful, and utterly aware that charm was his best defense. As Cold War tensions deepened, Washington's priorities shifted. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, years earlier than predicted. Panic rippled through the Pentagon. The only possible deterrent was a delivery system faster than any plane, a ballistic missile, and only one group of men in the world knew how to build it. Suddenly, the Paperclip scientists were no longer a moral liability. They were a necessity. The program that had been whispered about in secrecy became an open secret protected by national security laws. In Huntsville, Alabama, the Germans were relocated to Redstone Arsenal, a sprawling facility where they could work with greater freedom. Their families moved into neat suburban homes. American soldiers saluted men who had once saluted Hitler. The contradictions were staggering, but the results were undeniable. Within 5 years, von Braun's team had developed the Redstone rocket, the direct descendant of the V-2. Its purpose was no longer to terrorize cities, but to defend them, or so the story went. Behind the official optimism, however, a quiet unease remained. The Nuremberg trials had condemned industrialists for using slave labor, yet the scientists who ordered those same factories were now on the U.S. payroll. Evidence of atrocities lay, buried in archives marked classified. The files that might have exposed the truth were locked away, their covers stamped with a single word: restricted. Paperclip had done more than import scientists. It had imported silence. By the early 1950s, America had built an entire infrastructure around its new experts: laboratories, universities, and research centers devoted to aerospace and defense. Funding poured in, careers blossomed, and the line between ethical and effective disappeared. The scientists who once designed weapons for tyranny were now designing the future of democracy. It was a paradox only power could justify, and America justified it. The desert test became legend. Each launch lit the horizon like a second dawn, the roar of engines echoing across the dunes. Soldiers cheered as the missiles streaked upward, unaware or unwilling to remember that the designs came from a program born in terror. The V-2 had evolved into the Redstone, a weapon now painted with American colors. Progress had never looked so righteous. In 1950, the U.S. Army established the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, placing von Braun at its head. He was no longer a refugee scientist. He was a government official, a man with a budget, a uniform, and a mission. Newspapers printed his photograph, besides stories about America's rocket genius. His accent, once a mark of the enemy, became an exotic signature of brilliance. Hollywood took notice. Disney invited him to appear on television specials about space exploration, where he spoke of humanity's destiny beyond Earth. The audience adored him. No one asked about the thousands who had died to perfect his designs. Not everyone was convinced. Within the State Department, a few officials warned that the nation was replacing one moral blindness with another. Memos circulated about the scientists' pasts, but each was quietly suppressed. The Cold War demanded focus, not reflection. The Soviets had their own German engineers, working deep in Kazakhstan on their own missiles. The race was too close to risk conscience. "We must learn from them before we judge them," one general wrote. And so judgment was postponed indefinitely. By 1957, von Braun's team had produced the Jupiter missile, capable of reaching the edge of space. That same year, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, shocking the world. Overnight, von Braun went from controversial figure to national savior. The government turned to him for answers, and he delivered. His Redstone rocket placed America's first satellite, Explorer 1, into orbit. The man who once built weapons for Hitler was now hailed as the architect of the American dream. Behind the celebration, though, cracks began to show. Journalists started asking questions about von Braun's wartime record. Survivors of the Mittelwerk tunnels spoke out, describing the horrors they had witnessed. But their voices were faint against the roar of rockets. The public wanted heroes, not history. NASA was formed in 1958, and von Braun was chosen to lead its spaceflight center. The transformation was complete. From the ashes of the Third Reich, a new image had been born, the smiling, visionary engineer who would take humanity to the stars. Yet the moral paradox of Operation Paperclip never disappeared. It lingered in classified archives and whispered conversations, in the uneasy admiration that surrounded the German engineers. America had built its space age on the foundation of the Reich's forbidden science. The dream of reaching the heavens had risen from the ruins of hell, and for now no one wanted to look down. By the dawn of the 1960s, Operation Paperclip had already changed the trajectory of human history. Its architects no longer lived behind fences or under military supervision. They held government positions, directed research programs, and advised presidents. The program that began in secrecy had become the unspoken foundation of American supremacy in science and defense. The rockets were bigger, the laboratories brighter, and the moral fog thicker than ever. Von Braun's rockets were not the only inheritance of the Reich. American agencies had begun recruiting, the specialists, doctors, chemists, psychologists, whose wartime experiments had been as brutal as they were groundbreaking. Men who had tested freezing exposure, radiation, and poisons on prisoners now lectured in American universities, their pasts scrubbed clean. In the name of national security, the boundaries of ethics were rewritten. Dr. Hubertus Strughold, once a Luftwaffe physician who oversaw human experimentation at Dachau, was brought to Texas to develop aviation medicine for the U.S. Air Force. He became known as the father of space medicine. Few knew his experiments had cost innocent lives. When journalists questioned his history, the Air Force dismissed it as Soviet propaganda. The story disappeared, buried under the noise of rocket launches and presidential speeches. At the same time, the CIA began exploring new frontiers of control. Inspired by research recovered from German archives, it launched secret projects like Bluebird and MK-Ultra, using drugs and hypnosis to test the limits of the human mind. Some of the scientists involved had been paperclip recruits. They brought with them a cold philosophy that the end justified the experiment. Laboratories in Maryland and Montreal replicated methods once seen only in the camps of Europe, all under the flag of freedom. Everywhere the logic of paperclip echoed: progress first, questions later. The same government that condemned Nazi atrocities was now borrowing from their data. Jet pilots trained in chambers modeled after Luftwaffe test facilities. Pharmaceutical companies quietly used research derived from wartime human trials. The line between victory and imitation blurred until it vanished entirely. Publicly, America celebrated. Television beamed images of smiling astronauts, gleaming rockets, and engineers in white coats. The message was simple: science was salvation. No one wanted to hear that the price of that salvation had been paid in blood. Long before the first launch, the scientists themselves never spoke of guilt. They talked only of ambition, of destiny, of reaching the stars. Perhaps they believed that success would wash away the past. Perhaps it did for a while. But shadows lengthen even under bright skies. As the 1960s advanced, whispers began to surface, rumors of suppressed files, of names erased from Nuremberg, of men who had walked away from history unpunished. 1969, the world stopped to watch as a rocket thundered into the sky, its engines shaking the earth beneath it. Apollo 11 was humanity's triumph, the moment civilization reached beyond itself. Millions cheered, unaware or unwilling, to admit that the path to the moon had been paved by men who once served a dictator. The Saturn V, the pride of the American space program, was the direct descendant of the V-2 rocket. The same mathematics, the same mind behind it, Wernher von Braun. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface, von Braun wept as he watched the broadcast from Houston. The media called him a visionary, a redeemed genius. He gave interviews about faith, science, and the unity of mankind. The story America told itself was simple. Evil had been transformed into good. History, however, told a quieter story. The applause was loud enough to drown the screams of the past. Not everyone was celebrating. Survivors of Mittelwerk, the underground factory where thousands of forced laborers had died building. V2s watched the moon landing in silence. Some said it felt like victory had finally reached their oppressors. They used our suffering to reach the heavens, one survivor said years later. Even God must have turned away. Von Braun continued to rise. He became NASA's most trusted figure, meeting presidents and world leaders, shaping the vision of humanity's future. He spoke of Mars, of colonization, of peace through exploration. To most Americans, he was the embodiment of progress. To the few who remembered his past, he was proof that history could be rewritten with enough success. But behind his polished image, the same darkness lingered. Former SS officers still worked in U.S. laboratories. Files detailing their crimes remained locked under national security laws. The government insisted it had nothing to hide, yet every declassification request came back heavily redacted. The paperclip legacy had become untouchable, an open secret everyone agreed not to see. By the early 1970s, von Braun had grown tired and ill. He left NASA quietly, giving lectures about the moral duty of science. Our responsibility, he said, is not just to build machines, but to ensure they serve humanity. It was the closest he ever came to confession. He died in 1977, praised as a hero, buried with honors. Few obituaries mentioned the tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, or the lives lost there. The world preferred its heroes unblemished. Operation Paperclip had given humanity the stars, but the stars came with a price, a reminder that progress without conscience is just another form of conquest. The rockets had carried man to the moon, but they could never lift him beyond the gravity of his own past. The 1970s began with triumph and silence. The moon had been conquered, the Cold War raged on, and America stood as the uncontested leader of technology. Yet beneath the roar of rockets, a faint echo began to rise. Questions, doubts, and whispers that refused to stay buried. Journalists, historians, and a new generation of activists started digging into the archives of the war that had supposedly ended a quarter-century earlier. What they found cracked the shining image of America's scientific glory. In 1974, declassified documents revealed the true scale of Operation Paperclip. The program had not only recruited engineers, but also doctors, chemists, and intelligence experts with direct ties to Nazi crimes. Files, once stamped top secret, told stories of erased records, falsified dossiers, and deliberate deception. Many of the scientists who had been celebrated on magazine covers were shown to have used slave labor or conducted human experiments. The revelation hit like a second explosion, quieter than a bomb, but just as devastating. Arthur Rudolph, the engineer who had managed production at the Mittelwerk tunnels, found himself under investigation. The same man who had received NASA's Distinguished Service Medal now faced allegations of war crimes. When confronted, he denied everything, calling the reports lies spread by communists. But witnesses, survivors of the tunnels, remembered his face. The US government offered him a choice: renounce his citizenship and return to Germany or face prosecution. He left quietly, a man erased from two nations' histories. Others followed. Some retired before questions could reach them. Others were protected by the same agencies that had brought them to America. Justice moved slowly, and memory slower still. The Cold War needed stability, not scandal. For every file that surfaced, 10 more remained sealed. But the illusion had already begun to fracture. The myth of redemption no longer held. In Europe, survivors and scholars demanded accountability. They accused the United States of hypocrisy, condemning Nazism, while profiting from its genius. The American response was defensive, even proud. "We did what we had to do," one former official said. "If we hadn't taken them, the Russians would have." It was the same justification that had started Paperclip 30 years earlier. The war had ended, but the logic of survival had never stopped. By the end of the decade, the truth had become too complex for easy storytelling. Heroes were not purely heroes, villains not purely villains. The men of Paperclip had built miracles and nightmares alike. Their rockets had carried humanity into space and carried their secrets into the future. The cracks in the legend were no longer invisible. They were wide enough for history itself to slip through. By the 1990s, Operation Paperclip had become both legend and warning. The Cold War was over. The archives were open, and the last of the Paperclip generation had either died or faded into quiet retirement. For decades, they had been protected by necessity. Now they were protected by time. Their names appeared in history books as footnotes, their deeds softened by distance. But the documents told a colder truth, one that no patriotic myth could erase. Investigators uncovered letters, diaries, and photographs that painted a disturbing picture. The scientists who had shaped the modern world had done so while hiding entire lifetimes of complicity. Some had used slave labor, others had designed weapons for extermination. Yet all had been welcomed as saviors in a land desperate to outthink its enemy. America had won the moral war, but in doing so had quietly adopted the methods of those it condemned. It was not conquest that had changed them, but convenience. In Germany, the survivors of the Mittelbau Dora camps began to speak publicly. Their testimonies revealed what official records had long concealed. The same rockets that had brought man to the moon had first been built over the bodies of the enslaved. "They did not land on the moon," one survivor said bitterly. "They landed on our graves." The world had celebrated technology and forgotten humanity. Universities began teaching the story of Paperclip as a case study in ethics. Professors asked students, "Can knowledge born of evil ever serve good?" The answers were never simple. Some argued that science was neutral, that its use defined its morality. Others insisted that origin and purpose were forever linked. The debate spread beyond classrooms into philosophy, religion, and law. It was no longer about rockets or medicine. It was about the soul of progress itself. In Huntsville, Alabama, the city that had once been called Rocket City, a quiet effort began to reconcile the past. Museums added small plaques acknowledging the darker history of their founding fathers. School children visited exhibitions that showed both sides of the story, the triumph and the tragedy. For the first time, the shadows were allowed to share the stage with the light. It wasn't redemption, it was recognition. As the century drew to a close, one truth stood clear. Paperclip had never really ended. Its consequences lived on in every satellite, every missile, every laboratory funded in the name of security. The operation had not just imported scientists. It had imported an idea, that progress was worth any price. And that idea, more than any weapon, was the most dangerous legacy of all. History, when stripped of its flags and victories, is a mirror. What it reflects is not comfort but consequence. Operation Paperclip remains that mirror, unforgiving, necessary, and eternal. It tells us that nations built on ideals will still trade morality for advantage. The truth can be buried under the weight of success, and that the human desire to advance often outpaces the capacity to understand what it costs. In the end, Paperclip did what it was meant to do. It secured the minds that built the rockets, the jets, the missiles. It gave America the moon and the balance of power. It shaped the modern world, but it also proved something darker, that genius and guilt can share the same hands, and that history will forgive almost anything if it leads to victory. The men who arrived in secrecy as fugitives left this world as pioneers. Their sins were buried under the footprints of astronauts. Yet the question remains, can progress built on suffering ever be called advancement? Every rocket launched, every satellite in orbit, every whisper of technological wonder carries with it the echo of that question. The same flame that powered the V2 still burns in the engines of space exploration. Humanity has gone further than anyone in 1945 could have imagined, but it has never truly escaped the moral gravity of that year. Operation Paperclip is no longer a secret, but it is not over. Its lessons are written into every moral debate about science, warfare, and power. It reminds us that intelligence without ethics is just another weapon, and that civilization's greatest challenge is not to build, but to remember. The scientists of the Reich dreamed of conquering the stars. The men of Paperclip helped humanity reach them. But between those two dreams lies a silence filled with the names of those who never had a choice. When future generations look back at this century, they will see the moon, the rockets, and the marvels of technology. But if they listen closely, beneath the applause, they will also hear the whisper of history, asking the same question again and again. What did we trade for the sky?